What's going on, everyone? It's the Fantasy Football Almanac, back at it with another fantasy football video. Today we are going to be talking about wide receiver busts from the 2022 season, but before we get into it, if you guys could go down and give this video a like. I'm answering every single comment, so if you guys have any questions about fantasy football, about trades, anything, I'd love to help you all out, and subscribe to the channel, turn the notification bell on so you don't miss another video. With that though, guys, let's hop right into it. Before we do hop in, though, just want to give a little disclaimer. I'm not going to be talking about guys who are injured for obvious reasons. Guys like Cooper Kupp, who missed a large portion of last season due to injury. Well, it is disappointing that they were injured. Overall, Cooper Kupp played phenomenally well, so I don't want to talk about a guy like that. I'm going to be talking about guys who either played a large portion of the season, or if they didn't, had a very disappointing portion of the season where they did play, if that makes any sense. But with that out of the way, let's hop right into it. First guy I want to talk about is Deebo Samuel. Deebo Samuel is somebody who's very hyped up going into the 2022 season. This is somebody coming off a 1,400-yard receiving season with 6 touchdowns and also being used very, very heavily in the ground game, 365 yards and 8 touchdowns. Deebo Samuel was coming off the board as the wide receiver 7 this season and a 22nd player overall. So this was somebody with very, very high expectations. Not only that, the season before he was the wide receiver 2. Having over 300 fantasy points, which is something that very, very few wide receivers could ever claim to do in fantasy football. I mean, to put that into perspective, the only player who had over 300 fantasy points this season was Justin Jefferson, and he had 304. So Deebo was in pretty elite company, right? But this year, things fell apart for many reasons. For one, regression. I mean, it was totally expected that Deebo Samuel was going to regress from what he had last season. I mean, he had 8 touchdowns on the ground last season. I don't think anyone expected him to really sustain that level of touchdown volume, considering the fact that he only had 59 total attempts. I mean, it's just pretty much impossible to see that sustained level of touchdown volume with that amount of rushes. Secondly, this offense went through a ton of turmoil. I mean, we see Trey Lance go down early on into the season. Then we see Jimmy go down. Then we see Brock Purdy come in a third-string quarterback and actually play very well. We'll give him credit where it's due. But when you have that much turnover, it's hard to really get stable as a wide receiver. It's hard to get stable as a quarterback, a running back. Also, another thing, the amount of weapons they have in this 49ers offense is downright crazy. I mean, we have Ayuk, and Ayuk took a step forward. He has to get his. We have George Kittle, a very good tight end. He could pop off some games. Then we bring in Christian McCaffrey, the best receiving back in football, one of the best receiving backs I've ever seen in football of all time. And he's got to get his. Meaning somebody has to suffer, and that somebody just so happened to be Deebo this season, only having 630 yards with another 240 on the ground. I mean, that's not what you were expecting drafting Deebo. He finished this year as the wide receiver 40 in PPR scoring, which, I mean, he did miss 4 games this year, so that does have a knock on it, but even still, you're not expecting wide receiver 40 playing 14 games. To put that into perspective, Deebo Samuel was the wide receiver 23 despite only playing 9 games, so Deebo had another 4 games on Cooper Kupp. Cooper Kupp still vastly outperformed him. So Deebo was disappointing this year, and it does stink because, I mean, again, he was going around the wide receiver 7, 22nd overall, so that's that 2-3 turn, probably where he went in your leagues as well, maybe a bit higher for most other standard leagues, because I think the advanced underdog community was a little bit lower on him than most other people. But either way, you spend a 2nd or a 3rd round pick on Deebo. Very disappointing. The next guy I want to talk about is Allen Robinson, and Allen Robinson was somebody that was massively hyped up during the offseason. This is somebody who was coming off the board as the wide receiver 21, 57th overall on Fantasy Pros. But on Underdog Fantasy, I really wish I could find this ADP. I can't. He was going off the board higher in terms of its overall fantasy value, and he did not deliver, to say the least. I saw videos of people hyping him up. I saw bold takes saying that Allen Robinson was going to outperform Cooper Kupp on the season. Mind-blowing to me. Allen Robinson, arguably one of the most disappointing players in this fantasy season because the hype was absolutely unreal. The narrative with Allen Robinson was that he was a great wide receiver who just never had the quarterback. In 2021, 2 seasons ago, he looked absolutely done, just wanted to be out of Chicago. So the narrative, again, was that he just didn't want to play, and that's why he was as bad as he was. The wide receiver 81, despite playing 12 games, only 400 yards. Very, very poor showing. Then he goes to the Rams. And the Rams, fresh off a Super Bowl, great quarterback. They have Cooper Kupp, so he doesn't even need to be the wide receiver 1. The hype for Allen Robinson this offseason was unreal. And what did Allen Robinson do? Allen Robinson absolutely squanders every possible opportunity, never targeted in this offense. 52 targets despite playing 10 games, 5 targets a game. That is not great for a guy you're drafting as a middle of the pack wide receiver too. Only has 10 plus points 3 games throughout the entire season and consistently disappoints game after game after game. Felt like the exact same scenario as last year with Allen Robinson, where there was just no hope long term for him to be a great wide receiver. And this was the first game of the year, Bills versus Rams. I remember a distinct lack of Allen Robinson the entire game. We saw pretty much everyone else have fun. We saw Cooper Kupp get, 15 targets? And Allen Robinson, nothing. 0. Zilch. I don't really see any way Allen Robinson returns to being a great player. I mean, he's had 9 years in the league, 29 years old. What's lost is not found, according to the fantasy footballers, and I 100% agree. I'm off Allen Robinson. I think he is done. And again, one of the biggest busts this season. The next guy I want to talk about is Gabe Davis. This is another guy going in a very, very similar range to Allen Robinson on Underdog Fantasy. People could not get enough of Gabe Davis. And it kind of blew my mind. I did not understand it at all on Underdog Fantasy. On Sleeper, at least it made sense because he was going 4 or 5 rounds later. So it's worth the risk at that point. But on Underdog Fantasy, he was coming off the board as around the wide receiver 20. According to Fantasy Pros, he was coming off the board at the wide receiver 25 or 64th overall. On Sleeper, it was even later. But on Underdog, his ADP was absolutely ridiculous. I mean, a top 20 wide receiver. Top 20 wide receiver. That puts him as a wide receiver 2 at the position. He was expected to come in and fill a huge role left in vacated targets by guys like Cole Beasley. And it just did not happen. I mean, yes, he had a decent season. I don't want to rag on him because he is just 23 years old. But at the same time, this is not a season to write home about. This is not a great fantasy season in the least. Because aside from games where he had a 90-yard touchdown, like in the Steelers game where he had a 99-yard touchdown, he pretty much always disappointed, only having over 10 fantasy points. 4 games the entire season. It was not a great showing for him. Only having over 10 points 4 times the entire season, again, despite playing 16 games. He was the wide receiver 36 in PPR scoring, so not even close where you drafted him. On Fantasy Pros, which again was later than the Underdog ADP. Wide receiver 25, not worth it at all. And he also got 93 targets, but only 48 receptions. He did not look on the same page as Josh Allen. And I know you could say he's a deep ball guy. It makes sense he's not going to have as many receptions. But if you watched the games, Gabe Davis and Josh Allen were almost never on the same page. It felt as though they were always a step away from each other. The only thing that salvaged Gabe Davis's fantasy season was the fact that he had 7 touchdowns. He was known as a touchdown machine, and that it does make sense that he is going to have an above average touchdown rate given the role he fills in this offense. But it just never clicked for Gabe Davis, aside from one absolutely insane fantasy showing. And that's why I think Gabe Davis, while he will be a fine wide receiver, he's only 23 again, but he's been in the league for 3 years, so he did come into the league very young, which is a promising sign for the future. I was shocked at how little Gabe Davis was utilized on a game-to-game basis, and when he was, how not on the same page he was with Josh Allen. The next guy I want to talk about is Hunter Renfrow, and I'm proud to say I don't think I owned Hunter Renfrow in a single league. He was going much, much, much too high for my liking. Coming off the board as the wide receiver 38, 93rd overall. The reason why I didn't like Hunter Renfrow was a very, very simple reason. Davante Adams. When you have Davante Adams in your offense, it's going to be so hard for you to be consistently productive. But not only does he have Davante Adams, there's also Darren Waller in this offense, a great tight end in his own right. And I know he was injured for a large portion of the season, but in the offseason, we didn't know that. So we see Hunter Renfrow stepping into a ridiculous amount of competition, and the quarterback sustaining him is Derek Carr, and Derek Carr, well, an average NFL quarterback is not somebody who's going to be providing 30-plus touchdowns from season to season. He's actually never even had 30 touchdowns in a season. So if you're going to have somebody take a step back, it's going to be the guy that you think is the worst. And personally, to me, I thought Renfrow did put on a really, really good season before, but out of Davante Adams, Darren Waller, and him, I thought he was easily the worst. And it makes sense. Wide receiver 38 puts him in a spot where you would probably have to start him in some weeks if need be, because, I mean, wide receiver 38, that's a high-end wide receiver 4, very, very low-end wide receiver 3. So this is somebody you would have to trust to start. and he was not startable in the slightest. I mean, only in 10 games played, he only had 2 games with over 10 fantasy points. He finishes the wide receiver 93, only 330 yards, 50 targets, and 2 touchdowns. An abysmal showing from Hunter Renfrow. Just from a fantasy perspective, you just can't be happy based upon where you drafted him. And while he was a little bit lower down, I mean, wide receiver 38 is nothing ridiculous. Still definitely burned the fact that, I mean, he just wasn't able to help your team in the slightest. And by the time he came back and had his 10-point games, you already most likely had dropped him. Now, the last guy I want to talk about is Elijah Moore. And Elijah Moore was somebody who was getting a fair amount of hype going into the season. I mean, he was coming off the board 1 pick before Hunter Renfrow, 92nd overall and 37th wide receiver overall on Fantasy Pros. After his rookie season, there was promise for Elijah Moore. Because of how good he looked once he broke out, and from week 7 on, he most certainly broke out because he was the wide receiver 4 during that time span. Then unfortunately gets injured and is out for the rest of the season. But we saw his snap share increase from around 60% early on in the season to around 88% when he had his full takeover. But then again, gets injured. Still a ton of hype for him. They do bring in Garrett Wilson in the offseason, which is good for Elijah Moore in a way, because Elijah Moore doesn't have to deal with those cornerback 1s. He can have cornerback 2, relax a little bit more, and still have great fantasy performances. But the reasons why I think the Elijah Moore experiment went wrong this season were quite a few. I mean, for one, he wasn't the number 1 dog, so he wasn't the guy getting the ball all the time. And it did kind of surface out that he was kind of frustrated that he was not getting the ball as much as he thought he should have. And he did have a good rookie campaign, so maybe he should feel entitled to something like that. But also, Zach Wilson was a putrid quarterback, one of the worst quarterbacks I've seen, honestly. One of the worst quarterbacks in the entire NFL. Not great. And so it makes sense Elijah Moore would not do that well, but Garrett Wilson also did have 1,100 yards, so that aside, it does make sense that Elijah Moore would not play well. Only 446 yards despite playing a full 16 games and despite being drafted as a low-end wide receiver 3 in fantasy leagues. Now, the situation gets even weirder as he gets traded to the Browns. I was thinking about making a video on it about free agency. I'll talk about it quick here, though. I think this was a great trade for Elijah Moore because it at least gives him hope to be able to start in an offense next season. He could easily be the wide receiver 2, ahead of Donovan Peoples-Jones, behind Amari Cooper. You figure Deshaun Watson should take a step forward. I think he did look pretty bad last season, but also, I mean, he wasn't even allowed to play with the team, wasn't allowed to build chemistry. I think next year he's going to step in and be a lot better, so I think this is hopeful for Elijah Moore. But the situation was pretty dire for a while for Elijah Moore, so we shall see what happens with Elijah Moore next year, but certainly one of the most disappointing fantasy players of 2022. Anyways, that's going to be it from me. Hope you did enjoy. If you did, go give this video a like. I'm answering every comment. So if you guys have any questions, let me know down below. And subscribe to the channel, turn the notification bell on so you don't miss another video. With that though, guys, as always, have a good day, a good night, and a good life.